Hello everyone, thank you. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce the other panelists for this session. Jehan Bseiso, the absolutely extraordinary Palestinian writer, editor, researcher and aid worker. Mahdi Sabbagh, Palestinian urbanist, architect, writer, editor, the editor of this absolutely brilliant book, which I hope you have all picked up. And Mirza Waheed, a Kashmiri novelist who actually participated on PalFest last year and was in Palestine in May 2023. I also want to thank the Southbank for hosting this event, the PalFest organizers for their just tireless work in making this happen, all of you for coming out on a Wednesday night, and of course my wonderful co-panelists for joining. So in the time that we have, I'm hoping to moderate a conversation around the book, but also the invitations of the book, namely solidarity, mutuality, witness, and all of its related themes, one by one. So actually, I'd like to start with you, Mahdi. I've had the privilege of being your friend for many years, but actually when I was reading this, I felt like I related to you in an entirely different and new way. And before I ask you my question, I actually wanted to open just with the first paragraph of the foreword, which I just found so powerful. It was written by Yasmin, who's in her own right a really exquisite writer. February 12th, 2024. It is the 5th month of Israel's genocidal assault against Palestinians in Gaza. I know that by the time this book is printed and read by you, it will be worse than it is today. Today, Israel has killed more than 27,000 Palestinians in 4 months, displaced nearly 2 million Palestinians, starved the entire population through the winter, destroyed the healthcare system, and is poised to invade Rafah, the last standing city in Gaza, where most of the population is sheltering. So, obviously, that really terrifying realization that what was written in February is already a different reality from where we are today in July. So in addition to congratulating you, I think I want to ask the timeline of this book. So in the introduction, you situate the pandemic, you situate the Unity Intifada of May 2021, other really seismic events in recent Palestinian history and global history. How have you been able to curate and edit a book that deals with so much change in such a short period? And I guess related to that, how is it relevant and where does its relevance lie today?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Zena, for this question. It's a difficult one to answer. This project was difficult to work on. It was difficult before the genocide started as well. And as things got worse in Palestine, we had many moments where we were looking at the manuscript and thinking, is this right to put out into the world right now? There was an impulse to return to the drawing boards, to also give up entirely. There's a question of, what is this book in the grand scheme of things? But every time I questioned the purpose of this book, I went back to the writing in it, and I thought a bit of the framework of ongoing Nakba and what ongoing Nakba means, right? It's a context that I think means that Palestinian thought can be centered in a particular way. It also means that the timeline of this genocide is to be questioned, right? Not just to refute the idea that something starts on October 7th, but to think of the Palestinian experience of settler colonialism through the ongoing Nakba lens means that you always start at the beginning of settler colonialism at the Nakba and at the events and actions and changes that led to the Nakba. And so the genocide all of a sudden looks like something that's been in the works for many, many decades. Genocides don't appear out of nowhere. And one thing that the writing in the book does is that it expands our frame of time a little bit by looking at that context, at that material context, by looking at history, but also by looking at ideas and thought and different ways to approach solidarity that I think situate the genocide in a longer timeline. And it also kind of proposes that there is a particular futurity in mind there. Mm-hmm. This was one way that I found it possible to work on it, it's to remember both the context and the fact that there is life after genocide as well. And so this book becomes like an archive of a particular moment, I believe relevant in understanding what leads to a genocide and also understanding how we can live after the crime is over and the aftermath begins.
Okay, so in the context of that, then I actually want to turn to you, Jehan, particularly in the context of taking this moment that we're in, translating it to the extent we can, understanding it, making it legible. There's this gorgeous line in your poem, also in the book, which you should all buy, and you wrote this poem, or at least it was first published in 2019, this line, "Read the sky in Braille," which has kind of been haunting me ever since I've read it. So I'd like to ask you about legibility and translatability, if that's a word, of this moment. How can we make sense of it? And your poem that you'd read just now, I thought was really beautiful in that regard, this echoing back of social media, of secondhand knowledge, of pamphlets, and so much of information that we're getting in fragments. How do we make sense of this moment and make it legible?
Thank you, Zena, for that question. And imagine the poem I just read, I wrote in 2014. I mean, social media has, completely transformed since then, and it's just completely much more overwhelming. And it felt overwhelming even back then. The poem that you referenced, indeed, I wrote in 2018, 2019, as a response to the great marches of return, where Palestinians were just, walking to the fence, to the wall, to the border, to all the words that we use to describe what it means that they can't cross and that they're stuck. And actually, even right now, people are using the refrain, "There are no words," There are no words. You see those words everywhere. And I feel like we have to keep finding words, and I feel like writers, poets, have a duty to keep, diving into the wreck and the wreckage of history and of the now and of everything, and to keep coming up with words, because, the alternative is just not possible.
Which I think also makes PALFEST work so important, right? You take writers from all over the world and show them what is happening and kind of circumvent the intermediary of books and tweets and texts and, So actually, Waheed, I'd love to hear some of your reflections, having been there as a participant with other writers on the ground. So few months in the grand scheme of things before the genocide went into its active mode. Could you just share some of your reflections with us?
Yeah, thank you, Zena, and thank you everyone for coming. I went to Palestine last year in May, along with other writers from across the world, and with Mahdi, which was an honor, and as it's an honor now to be with Palestinian friends now. I'm aware we don't have a lot of time, so I made these notes. So what happens at PALFEST is you are in this tour bus, and you go, because Palestinians can't travel to each other's towns and cities, families can't visit each other freely. So the PALFEST bus goes to them from Ramallah to Hebron, to Haifa, to Jerusalem, if you don't know that. And I was in the bus, and you see the landscape of Israeli occupation and colonialism in front of you, and you try to make sense of it. I made these notes in that summer, in May, on the bus. So I thought I would start with those, and if I go over, you stop me at 2 minutes or 3 minutes.
Your time.
I'm not because they're raw notes from that bus, Note 1. It's evident to anyone who sees with open eyes and an open mind that Israel uses a deadly combination of all the colonial practices, and then some, to dominate and erase Palestinian life. The violence on the Palestinian body is one aspect of it. What is equally horrifying is the constant war on Palestinian homes and land. The settlements are just one tentacle, the wall another, the road system another, forever reaching, forever digging, the checkpoints. The term really doesn't fully describe what the Israelis have put in place. It's a vast, soul and body-crushing carceral system built with metal, concrete, technology, cameras, illegal laws, and genocidal weapons. There is nothing like this on the planet. It feels as though an alien machine which feeds on land has descended on Palestine and is eating it every day. Multiple mouths at work all the time, pushing Palestinians in all the time, their ground shrinking till they are forced to go underground. And from this place of shelter, this hiding place, they emerge now and then, as they must, to defend themselves against the invading machine. Note 2. As you look at the landscape in the occupied territories, in the West Bank, you get a clear sense of what Israel wants and has been implementing for the last 50, 60, 70 years. It wants to turn Palestinians into a subterranean, subhuman people. A people that will be permitted to subsist under the surface, used and disposed as a subservient class, a cheap resource, allowed sometimes to have an existence in an ethno-state. I began to get a creeping sense that we were walking through a meticulously put together system, the ultimate purpose of which was to establish a large, technologically enabled concentration camp, the likes of which the world has never seen. I say this perhaps because all the definitions, all the categorizations, the labels, and the legal codes fall short. It is something else. It is a short visit, not even remotely close to the experience of Palestinian life. How can one even begin to presume? And it's been a humbling, instructive visit. It was overwhelming and heartbreaking. And as a friend put it, also wonderful at the same time, because you also see the resilience of the Palestinian people, in various shapes and forms.
That was so evocative, the idea of an alien eating land. I think that's going to completely reframe how I understand this as a mode of operation. I think the reason I find PALFest and delegations generally so well-done delegations so powerful is the invitation to witness. And I think that really comes through in your introduction, Mahdi. You begin with the act of witnessing, and you go on to talk about solidarities, international and more localized. And you also talk about how do I pronounce that?
Mutuality.
Mutuality, thank you, Ya Allah. And so I think with a view to that, can you all share some remarks about the act of witnessing in this moment, both its power but also its limitations? What does it mean to be a Palestinian witnessing a genocide of your own people, but also what does it mean to be a human on this planet in the year 2024 and witness a genocide?
You're looking at me. I think Mahdi encapsulates it perfectly in the introduction. But for me, witnessing it has to be active and it has to be political. It is not removed. It is not passive. It's really very much an action, and one that continues and keeps changing. I think that we have a duty to witness, but also a duty to listen. And sometimes witnessing, it's not just production. It's also taking that step back and listening.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Witnessing needs to be active. I think also because we live in this world fully kind of filtered through the social media apparatus, and there's this sense that witnessing is pointless. It's why are you looking at these pictures and you're sharing them constantly? And there is a kind of helplessness in this particular mode of witnessing. But I think what we mean by witnessing is something a little bit different, a little bit wider. I think witnessing can't happen by itself. It is part of a political education. It is also a responsibility, or I think we call it it's like your civic duty to be witnessing certain events, certain crimes as they're happening, understanding why they're happening, asking questions about them, right? And witnessing is presented in this book as only one part of solidarity, right? The other is being mutual solidarity or mutuality, which is when two different populations reach out towards each other, to put it in simple words. And then the third one is that when there is a siege that you are part of, that you see, or that you're under, you have a choice to make, right? So the idea that you are always helpless, I think, is debunked in this book in a certain way, and I think we kind of reject this idea that there's nothing that you can do. By active witnessing, it means that you're witnessing with a particular purpose. You're witnessing to understand. You're not just witnessing because to kind of deal with some feelings of guilt or whatever, but you're actually doing it with a political project in mind. You're inviting others to witness with you. One example I bring up is from my childhood of during the Second Intifada, Ramallah was being bombed quite heavily. We were in Jerusalem. We were not getting bombed, but we had lost electricity. So we were doing a lot of our homework at candlelight, and there was one night where Ramallah was getting bombed a lot, and my father, invites me to go to the roof of our building and to look in the direction of Ramallah and to just look at the lights coming from the sky down onto the buildings, and then you could hear like a boom a few seconds later. And it was important to look. It was important to look at that moment, not to turn away, not necessarily to, it doesn't do anything for your sense of safety or fear, and it is re-traumatizing, and it does make you realize how vulnerable you are in that moment. But it also reminds you that you have to look at the crime itself, face it, and understand that this is happening because we live in this structure that is being colonized. We are being colonized, and this is what it looks like. It was a lesson in always looking towards something, in witnessing, really, and this is how I understood it, and this is just one of many examples that are in the book.
Waheed, I don't know if you want to share any reflections.
Very briefly, I think it is about bearing witness, and what do you do with it? I read Mahdi's act of witnessing what was being done to Ramallah, and I kind of remembered things from my growing up years in Kashmir and so on and so forth. But bearing witness and what do you do about it is what happened yesterday in the US Congress. So we all know Netanyahu is visiting, and he's going to be, all those things. We don't know why, but we know why. He's their boy. I mean, he's in the place where, which funds him, as, Mahdi and I were talking about him. But the act of bearing witness, a more important act happened when Jewish peace of, what was Jewish peace. Yeah. They went to the place and stayed there, knowing well they're going to be dragged away, knowing well they might be arrested, knowing well there might be physical danger to them. But they stood there and they bear witness that we do not want this. And we mark our presence here in this moment where this man has been invited, this man who's obviously charged with genocide and war crimes and is should be arrested. So I find that as a more productive and useful and meaningful act of witnessing in terms of what do you do with it.
I'm going off piece here, but I'm just thinking about my friend Mahdi Sabbagh, who presented a lecture at the Tate in May about prisons and archives, and chose at the end of the lecture to actually describe an image of the Israeli soldier who had walked into what used to be the library in Gaza and is sort of desecrating the books, instead of showing the image, because sometimes seeing the image, you lend a certain power to that image, and you kind of enable it to dominate you and to instill fear in you. And I'm sure, many moons ago at the beginning of this genocide, what a statement, but many months ago when this was all happening, you might remember the soldiers taking a photo with a flag on the beach and how violent an image that was. And I think there's something to be said about the selective witnessing, to bear witness, to then move forward with it, but not to casually lend your gaze to something to then move on from it. I'm riffing here, but I think there is something really important about that, because we are so oversaturated with images. And at this point, with the level of brutality, we have all seen more shrouds in the last 9 months than we have probably in our whole lives. So how do you maintain the importance of your gaze and your vision and the political act behind that and what you can do with it? How can you separate that from a passive observation or from a kind of casual disengagement with what you're saying. And actually it links, I think, to what Yasmin was saying. Also in the foreword, she writes about the obligation to look, quote, alongside and not only at. And I think looking alongside implies that you're standing side by side with someone, right? That you're shoulder to shoulder with them. And that's a very powerful positionality compared to at a distance or sort of letting that image or that the act or the event dominate you. I'm trying to think about the best way to go, what many directions of the conversation do we go from here?
Oh, Jen, go ahead.
Jen.
I just want to say that I think that we need to use all the tools we have. So that powerful choice of describing the image rather than showing it at that moment, did something and does something. And then I really think it's an individual choice, and even it differs from person to person. What is the threshold of how much literally you can handle visuals with no judgment there? There was, on the 29th of December, a video went viral of what I referenced in the earlier poem, of a relative of mine amputating the leg of his niece on a kitchen table. And I work with a medical humanitarian organization, and I couldn't look at that video, and I still can't see that video. I start it and then I stop it. And sometimes, so this is why, the gaze, yes, it's sometimes the literal gaze, but it's also what you look away from and what that does to you, and then how do you transform that. On standing alongside, and what Yasmin references in the introduction, I also have to say that I think we lose so much, and Palestine loses so much if it is held as an exception. Although it is the axis of so many injustices, I think that we gain much more by looking at how struggles and pain and suffering are connected, and what underpins all of that is often very common. So really, less exceptional, unfortunately, and much more global than we think.
Yeah, one suggestion I might make in how to think about witnessing, both as an active tool, but also as something that eventually leads you to solidarity. But in this formula, both witnessing and solidarity are practices. They're not things that you do once, and also they're not in and of themselves a goal, right? If the idea is to be in solidarity for the sake of being in solidarity, that's not really what this is about, right? The idea of it being a practice means that solidarity is something that's requires constant renewal. It's ever changing, right? So you are alongside a Palestinian in your act of witnessing. You also need to be open to the idea that it might look something different once, like if we're in the middle of a genocide now, solidarity looks like a particular kind of solidarity, whereas at the time when we wrote this, it was something else, and it will inevitably continue changing, until liberation. Solidarity is also a practice, as in a daily practice, and we try to show this, that both in the introduction and in the essays, that it is something that's almost abundant, that there's so much of it, and you can access it in very different ways. Each essay in this book does it in a very particular way. Each one evokes a different geography, a different access point through which to understand Palestine, and then through which to bring Palestine back to the different place that is being discussed. So I think it's important to think of it as a practice to me, because it kind of it begins to show you clearly what is and isn't effective or good solidarity, right? Because there are definitely actions that might seem that way on the surface, but then, I see this as like an example of tools that are at our disposal in both understanding and in fighting this, settler colonial war machine.
Yeah, I'm grateful that you resituated solidarity as a verb and something that needs to be constantly practiced in its truest sense. And actually, it made me think of something that was said in the first panel about leftist nihilism, and how that only works if you have absorbed or assimilated the idea of individualism. As in, if you are the only person, if you see yourself as only one unit, then of course a behemoth like global capitalism or settler colonial domination is insurmountable, because for one person it is insurmountable. But actually, the whole point of building global solidarity is a reminder that we are greater than the sum of our parts. But I also think it goes back to, and this is kind of where I want to bring in you, Waheed, that we have a tendency in the West, and of course we're sitting in London, which is sort of in some ways the epitome of Western intellectual thought and power and money and finance and all the rest, to feel despondent, because in London it is a despondent outlook, protests notwithstanding. The reminder, or the invitation to remember, is that we are part of a planet that is the majority of which understand and stand alongside Palestinians. And so it is very easy to feel like this is insurmountable from this position, but in the grand scheme of global power, this is a minority position. It's important to have that positionality. And Waheed, I know we talked about it earlier, and you said the time for analogies is over and Palestine is its own beast, but I would love some reflections from you on Kashmir and what came up for you while on the ground in Palestine in terms of overlap there.
Can I talk about Britain first?
Always, yeah.
Because you mentioned UK. So we are part of this. We support it. Our state, our government, we fund that state and what they're doing in Gaza. So this is something we must remind ourselves every day. That's why the protests in London and the UK are actually very, very important. And that's why when our Prime Minister dismisses street protests, corner protests as meaningless and useless, we must go out again in more numbers and protest, because we do not agree when our Prime Minister says that it achieves nothing. It will achieve something, because what is the other option? That we don't come out. That while somebody is making decisions about carrying on a genocide, what is the other option? That we say nothing, So that's very clear for me, that we must step up, we must speak up, and we say no to this thing, because that is what is available to us. What was the other question?
Just any reflections about Kashmir? Yeah.
You see, I grew up and I saw, all the violence and the horrors of military rule, military occupation, what it is to live, and witness it firsthand. What you become when you are from that kind of place. And we have a historic affinity with Palestinians. When I say that, I mean it's not a matter of discourse or academic work. Palestinians are part of, let's say, the weekly prayer, used to be at least, when you grew up in Kashmir. You pray for various things, you also pray for the freedom of Palestine. That was part of your daily life, your daily life. What has happened over the last few years is there's a complete silence in Kashmir. It has been silenced almost completely by way of mass surveillance. The governance is punitive. So all those things completely echo with what happens in Palestine. So you can't speak, you can't post anything on Facebook. You can lose your job, you can be arrested. Or all those things that we know of happen in Palestine have been happening in Kashmir forever. Right now, there is, Kashmir has been silenced because of this. It is probably the most militarized region on the planet. If you talk about the density of military boots, with regard to the population of Kashmir. So all those things mean that nobody speaks up. Very few people speak. They have been kind of silenced. Even when they want to protest for Palestine. So they can't, what they used to do historically, year after year on Al-Quds, Yom Al-Quds was a big thing, is still a big thing in Kashmir. People come out. But something remarkable happened recently. In Muharram, there are processions for other reasons, for religious purposes. But many people use that to mark their solidarity with Palestine. While they were coming out for a religious procession, so that's what they did. So I saw when I visited Palestine, I went to Ramallah, and Hebron was this. You see, when you're from a place like Kashmir, you think you know. and I used to be a journalist, so you have pretensions of kind of, you know a little bit about the world. But actually you don't, Especially when you go to places like when I went to Hebron, I think me and my friends, we were silent for a long time because you saw this, this cruel heart of an occupation. What it has done to what used to be a large city. There's about 250,000 people who live in Hebron. And we went to the city center, and you saw this complete silence. And there's prison-like gates through which children go to school, and we saw that every day. They have to pass through multiple layers of these security gates. And then you went to the what used to be, let's say, the Regent Street of Hebron. And I do not, as I said, I was a journalist, I've seen a little bit of the world. I do not remember a more desolate scene in my life when I went down that street. The shops from back in the day still there, the awnings there, the signage there, but they've been closed for decades. So you go down the street, all these shops that used to be probably in the day, glamorous shops or well-to-do shops, nothing. Because at the center of this old town is a military encampment. The military encampment has about 2,500 or 3,000 IDF soldiers. And they are there to protect about 300 settlers. And for that, they have hollowed out the heart of the city. And I couldn't process this for a long time, because how do you do that to a city of 250,000 people? It's kind of choke. And then you think that you've seen the worst of it, and then you go through this checkpoint, a different checkpoint, on, if I recall correct, Al-Shuhada Street, where we were casually walking through this, and you go through this because we chose to, and a bunch of us chose to go through this. They have what is called an AI-enabled machine gun mounted on this checkpoint. And it says Smart Shooter, like a brand name. And it was so casual and banal that, so then obviously I'd read a little bit about this, then I spoke with Omar, and he said that machine gun has images, photos of possible suspects, Palestinian faces, who might be shot at if they cross through the street. Even if that isn't true, the idea that you can have this machine which might kill people on its own, just because they're passing through, was kind of, as I said, that was the heart of how the Israeli colonial enterprise is designed. I was talking about Kashmir, wasn't I?
You did an excellent segue into Palestine. But I mean, actually, I think this does take us back to Gaza, because, when, again, a few months ago, the story of the AI bombs, the inaccuracy, how clumsy they were, the simultaneous doublespeak of this army is the most expert army with the most precision in the world, and everyone, all these dictators all over the world should buy the arms from Israel because they're so precise. They're so precise that they can have casualties on the scale that is absolutely unprecedented. Both of those things is true, but Israel is not culpable. I mean, trying to circle that square has been the job of people of conscience all over the world for the last 9 months. I'm aware that we're inching towards the end, and there are 2 questions I want to ask, if I may. The first is, I actually loved Dina Omar's...
I loved it too.
It was so good. It's an essay about gaslighting and conspiracies, and the fine line between conspiratorial paranoia and a massive gaslight from the whole world. So, if I'm going off piste here slightly, but I would actually just love your reflections on what moments over the last 9 months have felt like the biggest gaslight to you as writers, as artists, as citizens in this world, where you just think, what on earth is happening and how is this light being sold to us?
I think we need another hour, so stay seated and we'll...
That was my fun question, by the way. That's the... That's my question for lightness and joy in this panel.
I don't know if this wait, just before that, on AI, the program is actually called Lavender, the one that they're using in Gaza. And I feel like I could talk an hour also about the name and that. On gaslighting, thankfully, I try to keep myself, surrounded by good company, but sometimes difficult conversations happen. The hardest for me, and I don't know if this counts technically as gaslighting, but it's having to say that it didn't start on October 7th. That's perhaps one of the most... That's possibly one of the hardest things about this.
Well, I suppose that leads me quite smoothly into my last question, which is about the long view. And I think, again, Yasmin wrote about this so succinctly in the foreword. She says, what we're doing feels like it's too slow to stop what is happening in real time. And I'm sure for many people in this room, certainly for myself, I log into Al Jazeera several times a day, and there happens to be a new mass killing with every refresh. And I mean, that level of absolute abject terror is, for me, unprecedented, even with the Iraq War, even with so many other horrors that we've witnessed recently, that it can feel very hard to take the long view and to feel like, in the grand scheme of things, I mean, this century of settler colonialism in a region that is so steeped in history and so steeped in import and value and beauty, it's very easy to take these last 100 years as representative of that beautiful place's identity. And it shouldn't, because Palestine is and always has been so much more than those who dominate it. So by way of sort of bowing out, I would love some of your reflections on the long view, both from your lived experiences, your experiences as writers, the importance of the written word in taking the long view, the encouragement that we can draw from the long view, and what hope, without the performance of hope, just genuine, aspirational joy we might be able to take from a longer view of history, present and future.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think it's a very important one to keep in mind. It's very hard to think about the long view when you are witnessing this much destruction and killing, right? It's very hard to think about a before and an after, when what you're seeing is so kind of consumes your every thought and your ability to think clearly. There's, when the genocide begun, I was in New York, and I felt this like very strong need to be with my family and to be with Palestinians. So we were calling each other all the time. I called this one person, an elder who I work with for my research, who is in his 90s, just to check in on him, and I asked him, "How are you doing?" And he was just like, this is the price we have to pay for staying on our land. And he was reading poetry at 4 a.m. This is how he was passing his time. He had a sense of purpose and hope in a way that reminded me that this is someone who has been through a lot of wars. He is not surprised that there is a genocide in Palestine. I think I also would want to go back to the idea of ongoing Nakba, because this is where I think we begin to understand how structural this all is, how Palestine, yes, is a testing ground for Israeli weapons and technology, but also our own history, our own experience has all the ingredients we need to survive this. Ongoing Nakba means that the Nakba begun and continues to happen, right? That it did not end in 1948, that it continues to happen to this day. This is important because we start to look back at certain events in our history before this particular genocide, and we realize that these were in fact genocidal acts. I'm thinking of parts of the 1948 Nakba, the beginning of the Nakba, where if you look at just the city of Lid, that was a genocidal act. That was a total and complete annihilation of a city, the killing of almost everyone, the displacement of almost everyone. and then the placement of everyone who remained in a ghetto. It was called a ghetto by the Israeli army as well. This is not a term that we use in retrospect. This was a genocide. And so the idea then is that we have to keep using these words and thinking about the words that we use and revising them in order to understand this moment better. I think this term is key, really. Yeah.
Thank you.
Very quickly, I've been quite heartened to see the solidarity of language in the last 8-9 months. I know we kind of have to be careful with the word hope, but it kind of builds some kind of resilience and resistance. In that, I have seen a lot of the people use language to correct the misframing of Palestinians in the media. And it's been quite overwhelming. It's not sporadic. It's not a small section of people. It's a large number of people across the world who always, for the last few months, every time a big media outlet says, is Palestinian children are dying of hunger, there's lots of people saying, no, they are being starved by Israel. I've seen that happen again and again and again. Or bodies found in hospital compound, and there's been people across the pond everywhere saying, no, Israeli strikes killed these people. So I've seen that. That's been kind of a heartening kind of moment for me in terms of the language, because as the essay kind of talks so eloquently about the gaslighting of Palestinians, the constant examination, the constant questioning, the constant interrogation, which we saw in the early days of the genocide when Palestinians would be on TV and they would be interrogated. Or I remember this incident where there was a controversy about the death toll, where basically the Palestinians were asked to audit the death toll.
Which they did.
Which was, where actually they did, but if you think about it, it was a bizarre moment in terms of ultimately self-defeating, because what are you asking them to do? To say less people died. So you want lesser people to die. So you won't audit arms and weapons, but you want them to, state fewer numbers. So, but those things were questioned constantly by a lot of people. It wasn't the odd academic on the social media, posing the question. It was lots of people. So that's been a heartening moment for me, which, so if Israel has all these weapons from the West, from us and from Americans, Palestinians have all the world's words now, I would like to think. All the words are with Palestine.
As Queen of the Words.
Just a sentence. But something that I've seen going around as well is how much, speaking of the long horizon, and I'll say it in Arabic, but بدها نفس. So it needs breath. It needs, a lot of breath to be able to continue. So yeah.
يعطيكم العافية. Thank you so much for all the work that went into making this book possible and for gifting it to us during such a dark time. Thank you for your poetry, thank you for your writing, and for sharing this space.